The Arnold render view is what we are going to be using to actually see our render, and we can find that under Arnold and open Arnold render view. This menu is here regardless of what mode you are in. When you open this up and you hit the play button, then it's actually going to start rendering. And you can now see here on the bottom that we have a status bar. We can see what the status is, which says it's rendering. How long did the render take? 12 seconds. What's the resolution? What aspect ratio we're looking at? Are we 1:1? This just means that we're currently actually watching the full screen. What camera are we rendering from, and what are the render samples, and how much memory was used during this render. So we have a lot of information, and it's also a very intuitive render view to use. It has a lot of features. You really want to avoid using the default Maya one, which you can access by clicking this button. Let's just quickly see what this one looks like. So here you can see that now we're getting the default Maya one, and they might look similar, but the amount of control you have in the Arnold render view is just insane. And this is what we've been talking about throughout the series. There are features of Maya which are a bit confusing because it's a bit scattered across multiple areas. And this is one of them. The reason being, again, that Maya consists of a lot of different plugins which aren't that tightly integrated, and that's why we have a lot of rendering items in the Arnold menu itself and not in the rendering menus. So you would assume that all this would be spread over different ones and just be called rendering, but instead it is specifically under the Arnold menu. But I digress. The render view is very intuitive to use. You have very similar controls as you do in the 3D view, just that you only have two dimensions. We pan around, Alt middle mouse button, and we can zoom in and out using the scroll wheel on the mouse as well. If you want to save an image, we go to File, and now we can either save the image as it is, we can save a multi-layered EXR, we have different options as well. I prefer to just go File, Save Image. And then we can save the image in a directory we prefer. When it comes to actually saving the image out of Maya, we have to actually type in the extension. Now you can see that it says image type or image files, and we can set it to JPEG, whatever it might be. So we have to actually call this something like test.exr, and now it's going to export out an EXR. And here we now open up the EXR in Photoshop, and you can see that we have a perfectly fine 32-bit EXR right here. If you want to save as another format, you do exactly that. We can save that as PNG or EXR. When it comes to saving out images, just quick discussion regarding formats. When it comes to saving, and you want the highest quality possible, then you should really save as an EXR file. You can save as a 16-bit or as a 32-bit file. 16-bit EXR is most likely going to be perfectly fine for nearly all cases. But if you want to conserve space, you can use PNGs as well. PNGs are pretty good and they don't take up as much space as EXRs. Obviously, in cases like this where you have a 2 megabyte file, this is not a problem. But imagine if you have something which is vastly bigger than this. You know, this here is a pretty small image. You're rendering 4K and each image is like 50 megabytes and you have 10,000 frames, then it becomes quite serious. We can also change which camera is being viewed as well. We do that under the second tab where we can just go through different ones. Just make sure we hit the play button. Now we can just quickly go through the different views. Very intuitive way of doing it. This is why I recommend having actual render cameras, because now you can navigate in the perspective view and we can just go through the different render cameras right here. Then we have isolate selected. This is an amazing feature. We can click on an object in the viewport, and then we can click isolate selected, and it's only going to be rendering this object. So whatever is selected now, it's only going to be rendering actually only that object. And this also works with nodes, which we'll get into in a little bit in the nodes chapter. This means that if you're only manipulating a single node, for instance, you're looking at a texture, you will see the texture being flat in the render view, which is essential when it comes to any kind of shading or look deving when you're dealing with maps. So we can disable this. And here we can see the different channels. We have RGB, which displays all of them. We can click once to see the red, green, and blue. And then we're going to see the alpha, and then we're going to see the luminance, which just displays the black and white values as well. Then we can click 1 to 1. We just make sure this is set to actually the correct scale. It's very hard to actually know how close you are to an image. Clicking 1 to 1 will do that. Then we have a really awesome feature, which is the render region. You can access the render region by just dragging while holding down the shift key. And now you can see we actually have a render region. It's very intuitive to use, and we can just change the actual region by moving it around, by hitting the center, or we can change it by just dragging the corners of it. I do this all the time because, for instance, if you were changing the shader of this material, there's no reason whatsoever to display the other shaders. That's just a complete waste of computation time, and now it's vastly superior in terms of speed. If you want to disable it, you can click up here, or you can just shift click anywhere in the render view. Then we also have the exposure, where you can take this up and down. This works exactly like you would expect when it comes to exposure. This is exponential, so every stop up is twice as bright. So we set this to 2, now it becomes twice as bright. We set it to 3, it becomes again twice as bright. So this becomes very, very bright, very fast. I don't tend to use this a lot, but it can be handy if you just quickly want to see, oh, what does my scene look like if I were to just set this up by 2 stop or something like that. One thing which is also handy is that we can actually click in the render view itself. This is not just an image. We can actually see what's going on. We can actually click on the different items, and now we can select them. In a case like this is pretty trivial, but you might have a case where you have so many objects and you have to just specify where the object is in the scene or what shader is attached to it. Then we have the button here, which is stop. Currently it's not rendering, but if you are currently rendering and you want to stop it, you can do that. So if you can just stop it, and then it stops rendering right away. It says render interrupted. Then we can click on the guy next to it, which says hold scene updates. This means if we actually do something to the scene, then it's not going to update in the render view. Then we have the settings as well for it. This is where we can change the actual gamma, the exposure, what LUT are we looking at. We can also look at the pixel information as well. What's the average pixel we have? Don't tend to use this a whole lot, but it's handy if you have to change the view transform or the LUT, or if you have to change the gamma up and down. But you really shouldn't be touching any of this unless you know what you're doing. A handy tip as well is that we can go to Window, Status Bar, Display Pixel Information, and I see on the bottom, we can actually see the exact value and position of what we have. If we were just make this a bit bigger, we can now actually see that what color this is exactly, and we can see exactly what value this is. This becomes very important when we're actually dealing with texture maps, but it's also quite handy just to actually see what color we have. Our eyes are rubbish at actually displaying color. Something can look orange when it's actually yellow, or it's actually blue, and being able to display it here is quite handy. So that's under Window, Status Bar, and Display Pixel Information. What we can also do is we can go to View and Test Resolution, and this is where we can actually change the test resolution. Now I find that this is a little bit broken, so I actually prefer to just change the resolution under the render settings. We can find that under the gear icon, and then we can go scroll down a little bit, and here we have the image size. So I really prefer to set this directly here, because this is unfortunately not working 100%. So instead of setting this to HD here and then reducing it in test resolution, I'll just set maintain height, width and height ratio, and then I'll set this to something like 500, and then it will just update directly in my render view. Hopefully this is fixed in the version you're using, and if it is fixed, that's fantastic. And then you can go under View, Test Resolution, and then you can try it out. Sometimes it works like now, but other times it doesn't work at all. So up to you if you actually want to brute force it, or if by actually changing the resolution, or if you want to use test resolution. Really handy when it actually works, but just be aware that it might not work. What we can also do is we can store an actual snapshot. Storing a snapshot is really useful because this means that we can now actually compare one image to the other. So instead of having to memorize it or render it out or something like that, actually saving the image, we can just click this little guy on the bottom right, which is store a snapshot with the little camera icon. And now we have a snapshot of our scene. So if we now were to go in and change the shader, let's change the material to something different. Let's just make it white instead, so not metal, and we can change this to green, and now we can hit store snapshot, and we can go between the two by actually just clicking between them. So really useful stuff. You can also see the stats down here as well. So if you want to delete the snapshot, we can go to view and we can hit delete snapshot, and that will straight up delete the snapshot. And we can also just click on the eye to go back to the current version as well, and we can just make this snapshot disappear like so. We can also select it and just hit the delete key, and that's simply going to delete it. A little tip as well is that we can go under render, debug shading, and then we can just dock this, and then we can go through a few different ones. What this is useful for is that it allows us to actually see what's going on in the scene. At this point, there is nothing going on in terms of shading or lighting, but we can see the models very accurately. And this means that if we have displacement issues, or we just have to debug the scene, we can see what the scene looks like without anything. So let's say we have some shading issues, we have some issues in the scene and we're not sure where we're coming from. We can look at basic and we can see, okay, is there an issue with my actual model? All right, this looks fine. Okay, is there an issue with my actual lighting? Okay, this also looks fine. Using occlusion, we can have a better view of what's going on. We can see the wireframe. It's just a really handy way of actually seeing what's going on in our scene. So I highly recommend this if something goes wrong in your scene. One feature as well you probably want to know about is that we can update the entire scene. Sometimes when you're rendering and you're doing all these changes, it doesn't actually update the scene. It keeps progressively rendering and it looks like everything is fine, but it hasn't actually updated the scene. And that's because we have to manually force a refresh. We can now update full scene, and that's just gonna do a full scene update, which is awesome, because now we know that we have the most latest version of the scene in the render view without any problems. The hotkey for that is Control U, so you might see me at sometimes later on where I'm just clicking Control U, and then it will just refresh the scene. We can also hit the spacebar to resume and pause the render as well. So there's a lot of hidden depth in the render view. It's not actually just a view to see your renders. There is a lot of clever ways we can make it work, like using snapshots, like using isolation, displaying the pixel information on the bottom, going through the different render cameras we have. We also have a feature which is over here to the top left, which is it just says beauty, and this is an AOV system, basically a render pass system. We have a whole separate chapter on that as well.